It's said that the phrase Saturday morning cartoons isn't meaningful to anyone under the age of 23. Cartoons are ubiquitous now, with several cable channels dedicated to airing them.
But for us 80s babies, we knew what it meant. It meant you were about to watch some of the most exciting, highest production value, and many times bizarre children's programming. Some of the plots were lifted straight out of our pubescent heads, such as being sucked into a video game and living out adventures along iconic gaming heroes like Mega Man and Link, fighting in robotic space battles, or holding a job that can only be described as ninja/monster.
But why aren't there any cartoons like this produced before the 80s? Were past generations just too primitive to conceive such awesomeness? The answer is more sinister and ominous than you might imagine.
Welcome to the secret history of Saturday morning cartoons.
Our story begins in 1940 with the dawn of the television age. Televisions in one form or another had been around since the early 20s, but the television industry as we know it didn't begin until the early 1940s. In the beginning, there were four TV networks: ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. There was another fifth network named Dumont, but no one remembers it because it went out of business in 1956. The manipulative power of television and mass media in general was understood very early on. The corporations that built the first radio networks and later television networks were acutely aware of this. Radio, during its heyday, was very influential too, but not to the same degree television was proving to be. Television seemed to envelop its viewer, placing them in an almost hypnotic state for hours on end. Viewers focused all their attention on the program they were enjoying, and in turn, focused all their attention on the commercials that aired in between. Radio still required the listener to consciously imagine what was being described, but television required no such conscious thought. It appeared to bypass the sensible and grounded mind and tap into the deeper, more primitive reptilian brain. We've all found ourselves watching a TV program not because we were enjoying it, but because there was nothing better on to watch. It seemed like our energy and enthusiasm to find something better to do was drained from our bodies and psyche. Because of the enormous power to influence the populace, the practically non-existent competition, and the excessive corruption those two factors would inevitably lead to, the Federal Communications Commission was charged with regulating this new emerging industry. Excessive advertising was one of the rules that the FCC enforced. No TV station could broadcast an excessive amount of ads during a given day. The bizarre thing was that there wasn't a hard and fast rule on what was considered excessive during the 40s and 50s, but a generally accepted guideline was no more than 10 minutes per hour. For the most part during the 40s and 50s, no network willfully violated these unwritten rules. The 40s were an immensely profitable time for television, and the 50s even more so. Whenever the FCC found programming to contain excessive advertising, they would issue a warning. This was more than enough to make a broadcaster change the program to make the FCC happy. Because of the massive amounts of profits television was generating for these corporations, nobody even wanted to slightly risk being taken off the air by the FCC. Nobody would seriously try to weasel around these rules until 1969, with the airing of the Hot Wheels Saturday morning cartoon. This was a cartoon about a group of teenagers that raced around in Hot Wheels. The show was basically designed to promote Mattel's Hot Wheels line of toys. This led Topper, a rival toy company, to file a complaint with the FCC. In their complaint, they said that Mattel and ABC had filed fraudulent commercial time logs with the FCC. All television stations were required to log how much time was dedicated to commercials while a show was playing. If a show played for 25 minutes and there were 5 minutes of commercials, the station would log that with the FCC. ABC had told the FCC that they were only playing 5 minutes of commercials during the 30-minute airing of Hot Wheels. Basically, they were only counting the time advertisements played during the commercial breaks of the cartoon. Topper claimed that the whole show was one long 30-minute commercial, and that ABC's filings of logs showing only the airing of 5 minutes worth of ads was a sham. The FCC agreed with Topper, because it was pretty blatantly obvious that Mattel and ABC were shamelessly pushing toy sales with the program. But the FCC didn't make an official ruling against ABC. Instead, it wagged its finger at ABC, but didn't take any punitive actions against them. This allowed ABC to finish its 2-year contractual obligations to Mattel and Panamine Pictures Corporation, who produced the cartoon. ABC did not renew its contracts with them and quietly canceled the show in 1971. From that point on, the FCC would make ever more important rulings regarding children's programming, making it more restrictive to produce kids' shows for the small screen. First was the banning of host selling. This is when a character endorses or tries to sell a product within their own show or within another TV program. Also, they'd warn content producers about, but didn't outright ban, the practice of product tie-in, or the placement of merchandise or an advertisement for merchandise within a show. The FCC warned that this could lead them to consider the entire show an ad, thus causing the station to violate the excessive advertising rule. These rulings would remain in effect for a decade and shape the way cartoons and other youth programming was created all throughout the 70s. That is, until the 80s and the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan was a Republican who was elected President of the United States in 1980. He was a big proponent of small government. The way he went about things, though, you'd think he was going for barely any government at all, at least as far as regulatory power went. What Reagan wanted most was to abolish most, if not all, rules regulating the way corporations did business. This process was also known as deregulation. During his presidency, Reagan would deregulate a huge variety of businesses, from banks to airlines. One of the many industries that he would deregulate was television. Reagan appointed Mark Fowler to the head of the FCC. Mark Fowler supported Reagan's deregulation agenda and began reversing many of the old FCC rulings regarding content. Fowler lifted the ban on toy companies that kept them from producing cartoons about their products. Fowler justified his decision by arguing that the then new technology of cable television made the old rulings obsolete, because of the amount of channels that a person could potentially tune into was no longer scarce. As stated before, one of the major justifications for the FCC's ability to so closely regulate the content of television was because of the tiny number of networks. Fowler argued that cable television made that argument false, because cable television gave consumers such a wide range of programming choices, so they could just switch the channel if they didn't like what was offered, whereas in the past that wasn't really true. Even though Fowler was technically right, cable TV at the time had a very low adoption rate. It was new, so not many people had it. Fowler's reasoning for reversing the old content rulings of the past would come under heavy criticism, and would eventually be overturned later on. But in the meantime, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe would be aired in 1983, based on Mattel's action figures. He-Man was not technically the first cartoon to take advantage of deregulation in children's programming. That honor would have to go to Pac-Man, which was released in 1982. But it was the first to become so ridiculously successful. Not only was He-Man made to market a line of toys, but it also depicted far more violence, such as punching enemies, which had been barred by the FCC throughout the 70s for children's animation. Since this type of powerful direct advertising to children had been off limits for so long, He-Man quickly became a huge success and brought in over $500 million in revenue in its first year of airing. The very next year in 1984, Transformers would air, based on Hasbro's line of robot toys. It too became wildly profitable, raking in $100 million in revenue in its very first year. Hasbro would meet success once more the very next year after with the release of the G.I. Joe animated series, which would generate $200 million in revenue in its first year. The success of these franchises would create a gold rush for toy makers and television studios. In all, nearly 70 of these types of children's commercial entertainment would be released between 1984 and 1989. All 70 of these shows were an attempt to either promote a toy line or a video game to their young audiences. So what's so terrible about all this? Sesame Street had and has a toy line too, and that's not considered bad. The difference is Sesame Street and shows like it weren't specifically crafted to sell both the program and the licensed products. Also, shows like Sesame Street are designed to primarily entertain, while shows like G.I. Joe are constructed more like commercials, where the primary purpose was to persuade the audience into a purchase. Plus, the way persuasion was being used seemed a lot stronger in these new shows like G.I. Joe. Many parents felt these shows had a far deeper influence on their children than the shows they grew up with had over them. This was because, well, the shows did. Not only were these shows employing marketing techniques and depictions of violence that had previously been banned, they were employing sharper and more cunning marketing ploys that bypassed critical thinking far more effectively than in the old days. These procedures had been in development for years in university psychological research facilities throughout the country. The research was paid for by various toy companies themselves, and it was not general children's psychological research. It was research specifically in the way to make children crave a product. Ron Friedman, writer and creator of the first G.I. Joe cartoon, even alludes to this type of research in an interview on the DVD
I
box
have
set
a
of G.I.
unique
Joe.
fix on what young people, kids, young people, young adults want and look for, and I came upon it when I was in architectural school. The provost of my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon University, was my mentor. For some reason, the guy liked me. So he volunteered me in a pilot project to determine what grabs young people to buy toys and games. The idea was to discover what the paradigms were, for whom? For toy manufacturers who paid for the pilot project. So I was fortunate, and I was one of those who tested some games and toys with children who were volunteered by their parents, playing with a kid, with a game that you have to share, introduce, a board game with a 6-year-old, and a complicated card game with a very bright 5-year-old. The 6-year-old was a girl, the 5-year-old was a boy. With the Department of Psychology evaluating all of this, filming it, recording the voices particularly to hear how the child's voice changed when receiving or rejecting certain information. All I can tell you is I learned how to approach children. I also came to understand what children need to hook onto, not just children, young adults. What is it they are looking for that appeals to them? It's identification. If a kid can recognize in an adult qualities that he or she ascribes to, heroism is one. Every kid wants to be heroic. Sense of humor is another, a vital one. No kid likes anybody or anything that doesn't have a sense of play about it. So I really had a clearly defined set of requirements to get to an audience of young people. And I remembered that, and I've used it again and again and again.